Welcome to yet another edition of Expressions for the New Indian Express. I have with me two gentlemen who succeeded each other in two separate countries, but especially in the US, which is our focus of discussion today. Ambassador Arun Singh was ambassador to the US between 2015 and 2016, so saw the tail end of the Obama administration. Ambassador Sanna succeeded him 2016 to 2018. So in a way, came in with Trump and all the high expectations that, well, initially I think confused expectations, and then eventually what seems to be a beautiful relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi. We'll hear a lot of all that from both gentlemen. May I quickly begin with Ambassador Sanna, because he was most recently there. How do you see the new ticket, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris? How do you see this as impacting the relations between India and the US should they come to power?
Well, that's a very large question, Kaveri, and we'll probably have to come and break it up into little things as we go around along in the discussion, because I think that's going to be sort of an overarching umbrella question on whatever we say. But if I can sort of kick off by saying that we must remember that for about 20 years, the India-US relationship has been steadily on the improve graph. And if you can go back to the Clinton days till now, I think it is an upward graph in many ways. And this has been happening no matter whether it's a Democrat administration or it's a Republican administration. And for that matter, you know, even with the changes of government in India, this relationship has been moving up.
Right.
What has been different are certain, you know, in certain respects, certain nuances, certain emphasis of the relationship. But fortunately, both the Republicans and the Democrats have recognized the strategic logic of a good relationship with India. The importance of India as, by and large, an economy which has been on the rise, particularly after our economic reforms began to bite. A country which has a tremendous amount of, you know, highly qualified professionals available for US companies. And, you know, I know there are problems in that, but by and large, that has been a source. And again, as a democracy, as a country with which they have comfort, not just in pure value terms, that's something which for 75 years we've been talking about between India and the US, but not always, you know, still being able to match up in strategic terms. But now there has been a matching up in strategic terms, the nuclear deal, followed by a lot of security and defense compacts, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, increased weapons sales, and more comfort for us, for instance, on the counterterrorism aspects. So all this is there to base ourselves on, no matter what the next administration is. Now, if we see the Trump administration giving way to the Biden administration, then the changes that will come in will not only be for India. Right. I mean, there will be a certain turning of US foreign policy all over the world, because Trump has really taken it and ripped it apart and thrown it upside down and done everything possible that he could with it. So it will be a change of stance of US foreign policy, looking out, going back into globalization, assuring allies, working with alliances, getting back into multilateral organizations like WHO, UNESCO, into compacts like the Paris Climate Agreement. So all this will change. Now with India, what will happen is that sooner or later, I think we will be able to get the story back. There will be glitches if it is the Biden administration. Everybody's talking about the fact that they are going to be much more demanding, as Democrats tend to be,
Yes.
on things like human rights and related issues. So to what extent that actually disturbs the strategic logic of the relationship, we'll have to see. But I think that's the challenge before Indian policymakers, Indian diplomats, is to keep the focus on the ball for the incoming administration and tell the India story in the right way, so that we can continue to move upwards. But there will be changes of nuance, and and I don't want to hog the conversation at this time, but happy to come back
Sure.
after Arun has
Yes.
spoken.
In fact, Ambassador Singh, I wanted to bring you in right at this moment and ask, since you saw the tail end of the Obama administration, will it be more of the Obama view of the world?
So in fact,
Should Biden come up? Should Biden take over?
Well, not just the tail end of the Obama administration. In fact, I happened to be in the Indian Embassy in Washington through the bulk of the Obama administration.
Exactly, yeah.
I went there first in 2008 as the Deputy Chief of Mission. Unfortunately, I arrived just one day before the nuclear agreement was finally signed.
Wow.
So I didn't contribute to it, but I benefited a lot because it really helped the relationship. And then I was there till 2013 April. And I came back in 2015 and I was there till 2016. So I was there through the bulk of the Obama, or what has now been described as the Obama-Biden administration.
Right.
I saw them in play. So I would, and then although I left towards the end of 2016, I was present at both the Democratic and Republican conventions, where the formal nominations of the candidates were approved. And so I saw how that process and the political projection was happening there. So keeping that in mind, whoever wins, and I agree with Navtesh there, whoever wins in November, I think broadly we will be at a good place. But each administration will present its own set of challenges. If Trump wins, they've been supportive of us broadly on the issue of terrorism.
Yeah.
At the same time, they have gone ahead and done an agreement with the Taliban, not fully taking into account India's interests. They have been supportive of us on our security concerns, let's say related to China. They've talked of the Indo-Pacific, building a more cooperative relationship. They have increased levels of technology on offer to India, put India on strategic trade authorization level 1, which is meant for the closest partners. And at the same time, and then also in the context of what happened in Ladakh recently, repeatedly, they have called out what they have said, Chinese assertive and aggressive actions. In eastern Ladakh, and equated that with what China has been doing in South China Sea, East China Sea. So they've taken a clear position. At the same time, they have gone ahead and taken actions against us on trade issues, which the kind of which didn't happen during the Obama administration. For example, imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum imports on national security grounds. Now, if we are a strategic partner, how do you cite national security grounds? Or removing GSP benefits for exports from India for certain categories of products. Focusing on the bilateral trade deficit with India. When India, although it has a positive, it has a surplus with the US, is overall a trade deficit country. And then the actions they've taken on the H-1B visas, for example, suspending them essentially with some exceptions till the end of the year. So these are the kind of actions that Trump has taken, driven by his America First and focusing on his own core political base, which have not been so positive for India. Similarly, if we look at the Obama administration, they really advanced the relationship with India. Obama was the first president to visit India twice in his tenure. No US president had done that. He declared support for India's permanent membership of UN Security Council. He worked to get India into various multilateral export control regimes, and they succeeded broadly except in the nuclear suppliers group. And they declared India a major defense partner. Now, you'd have seen that the Biden-Harris ticket, as it is now being called, in the context of 15th August, put out a video message by both the presidential and vice presidential candidates, and then a specific statement on their approach to India and Indian Americans, and very positive in terms of support for India, support for India's concerns related to terrorism, regional issues, border issues, and how they will be supportive. But again, going by what we had seen during the Obama administration and the kind of policies that Vice President Biden had himself been associated with, as Navteet said, there will be an enhanced focus on issues related to climate change and what they would see as issues related to human rights. And one has to manage that.
Right.
Because one has to understand that the democratic platform in the US today is built very much around tolerance, diversity, and pluralism.
Yeah.
Because that's the people, the voters they're drawing, the minorities, African Americans, Hispanics, Indian Americans, center, left of center oriented people. So that's a very important part. And if you look at the Indian American community in the US, they have largely flocked to the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Because as a minority group, they will flourish within the kind of framework that the Democratic Party espouses. Some have oriented towards the Republican Party, but largely those who've done very well are economically very well off and now worried more about taxes rather than the issue of diversity and inclusion. So given all that, I would say that from the indications we have now, from the statement put out by the ticket, from a recent article that Biden himself wrote in Foreign Affairs, and some of the comments and articles by his key advisors like Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, it is clear that there will be a sort of a continuation of what one saw during the Obama period, but of course adjusted to a different world. Because the world in 2020, 2021 is very different from the world in 2016. China has emerged much more on the international stage.
Right.
There's the devastating impact of COVID, impact on politics, impact on economies, and so they have to adjust to that. And also during the Trump administration, Trump has really undermined US relationship with allies and partners, many of them. In Europe, to some extent, also South Korea created some uncertainty in Japan. So at a time when the allies would be watching that if the US could produce a Trump, could the US electorate, even if there is a Biden now, again produce a Trump some years down the line? So where is the US now internationally? And so they would all be redefining their policies, looking at more space for themselves. So the administration would be working in a different international context. So there is bound to be some nuancing, and India will have to watch that and work around that. But I would say each administration will pose different set of challenges, but broadly, it will be a positive trajectory.
Yeah, thank you. Ambassador Sana, I wanted to take off from what Ambassador Singh said and talk a little about the way the Americans are expected to vote in 2020, especially post-COVID. How do you see that? And then, of course, talk a little about the Indian American vote as well. How important and how key are they? They are the richest minority in America.
Well, you can't call this election now. It's going to be a close election.
Right.
And but what I can say is that 6 months ago, pre-COVID, President Trump looked like set for another term.
Yes.
When in fact he was speaking in Ahmedabad, at that time, it looked very certain that he'd get another 4 years.
Right.
Joe Biden, he had quite decimated him as Sleepy Joe and various things like that.
Sleepy Joe.
Yeah, everything Joe. And, and Biden, frankly, was not doing well in the primaries at all.
Yeah.
In fact, his, first 3 appearances, his campaign was in the ditch, more or less. And then it got saved in South Carolina, primarily by the black voters.
Yeah.
And so this is an important thing to remember. However, there have been things in the last 5 or 6 months which have hit Trump. One, of course, is his handling of the pandemic.
Yeah.
We've seen he first thought it will go away by a certain date and all that sort of thing. The way he has, been perceived in the country as favorite, being, taking the Republican states as favorites for facilities, etc.
Yeah.
So that's been one thing that's gone against him. Secondly, the economy.
Yeah.
And because that's something which he prided himself on, that look at the stock exchange, look at the economy. The stock exchange may still be doing well, but the economy is not doing well. So, they got the highest number ever have gone into the unemployment zone since the Depression.
Right.
There's going to be the largest contraction in the US economy in the last 70, 80 years. That's happening. So these are things on which he prided himself and which have gone wrong.
Also,
And,
his handling of race relations, I think.
and thirdly has been the fact that race has come to the fore.
Yeah.
He's sort of run a administration of racial grievance, and he's openly, and he's misread the signs of the times in terms of race, in terms of attitude towards the Confederate history,
Right.
in terms of individuals. Like at one time, he seemed to have misread the gender issue.
Yes.
And I think it's a combination of the gender issue, but today it is the race issue which is on top, and which is, of course, one we can lead into that at some stage why, Kamala Harris has been brought in by Biden. But so all these issues have given, and Biden has picked up. Biden has picked up in his presentation. Biden has picked up in his campaign strength. The people who are now joining him, and the broad appeal to a country which is seeing its leadership being mocked and being laughed at all over the world, which has seen its footprint shrinking. I mean, yes, Americans wanted their footprint to shrink even under Obama. That, we really don't want to be in Afghanistan. We really don't want to be in Syria. But here it is shrinking in just not military terms. It is shrinking in moral terms. It is shrinking in leadership terms. So Trump has really, during the COVID thing, not been able to provide what the leader of the free world, as he is called, should be, the leadership that he should be providing to the world. So to cut a long story short, the race is going to be close. From what one sees of the ratings and etc. today, Trump is trailing. And Biden should have, but anything can happen from now to then. He's desperately trying. For instance, he's trying for victories.
Yeah.
He's got this UAE-Israel deal, which he's projecting as a big victory. Who knows what else he will try from now to then. And any sort of snafu on the part of the other ticket can still bring Trump home. Right. Because we must remember that he has a fixed constituency in which he hasn't lost.
Right.
They are his base.
Yeah.
And they are the base. They are the people who are anti-global. They are the people who believe in America first, who believe in white America, who believe in evangelical Christianity. So all this put together, that lobby of his is not going away. So Biden really doesn't have too much elbow room, frankly. But given the way the Electoral College works, there is a chance. At the moment, it looks like he might scrape through.
Right.
As far as the Indian American community is concerned, as Arun mentioned, they've traditionally been Democrat supporters. According to one study last 2016, 77% of the Indian voters voted Democratic. But that may have changed to some extent because while a lot of them vote Democratic in recent years, given this huge rallies, for instance, the Houston rally, the Ahmedabad rally, it showed you how many Indian Americans can be pulled out to listen to Trump. And Trump has actually ignored certain aspects in the relationship and gone for strategic convergence. And basically, if you see it on plus or minus terms, in hardcore practical terms, he's actually been good for India.
Yeah.
Arun listed out the various things that happened. We got the STA1 status during this thing. The Pacific Command became the Indo-Pacific Command. We've been, increased our military exercises tremendously under him. We've signed agreements, the foundational agreements, as they are so called, which we hadn't done with the earlier regimes, and that gave teeth to what Obama did in his last days, as granting us a major defense partnership status.
Yeah.
So there is a certain constituency, I believe, in the Indian American community, which because of this would see that Trump is good for India, so maybe we do go Republican. And therefore,
Ambassador
this
Singh,
is
yeah,
probably the older generation who
yeah,
also are a little angry, I would say, or a little irritated at the Democrats carping on in what are considered India's internal affairs.
right.
So there may be a little shift, but still broadly democratic, and they could play a very important role in some of the battlefield states where they largely reside, many of them.
May I bring in Mr. Chawla, who's just joined us? Mr. Chawla, you have a question to Ambassador Singh?
But I missed the initial discussion of 25 minutes. The last one, they were speaking about that you were saying it's a close race, then you were talking about how India is going to be a good big factor because Trump is depending on India. I would like to know for Namtej and Arun both together, that don't you think that vote bank politics, which was the specialty of Indian politics, has also entered America?
Ambassador Singh, perhaps you could take that first.
Yeah, so I would say that vote bank politics has been there in America always in one way or the other. And it's just that I think there are two dimensions now. One, that there is a core base that is with Trump, and they say almost 35–40% of the electorate. And these are the people broadly in the American middle class who felt that in the last 3 decades of globalization, while the US economy benefited, the elite in the US benefited because the top 1% now generates 40% of the income and 40% of the wealth. They lost out because their wages stagnated, death rates went up, longevity came down, drug addiction went up. So this segment, and this is the segment that Trump tapped into. Because otherwise it was a sense that the East Coast and West Coast elites were talking about globalization, America being exceptional, reaching out all over, but their interests were not being factored in. And this is the kind of base that Trump has held on to. And despite all that has happened, despite whatever has been the impact of COVID, despite the impression of the president being unpredictable, not very savvy in terms of his practices, in terms of his pronouncements, undermining alliances, this base so far still remained with him. And therefore the battle is for the Democrats to turn out the base and get the independents over to the Democratic side. Similarly, as Prabhu pointed out, I think on the Democratic side, there is a new kind of vote bank politics or voter base that is emerging, which draws upon center, left of center, white segment of the population, the college educated segment of the population. Because again, in the US, they have found that those who enter colleges, they tend to move more towards the Democratic side, except for those who are very, very rich and looking at taxes. But those who are not college educated tend to be a little more Republican. So that's one segment. And then the minority voters. The Jewish voter, 80% of the Jewish votes have traditionally gone to the Democrats. Now, of course, Trump has shown himself to be a big supporter of Israel. He is now midwife this agreement between UAE and Israel. So then that will attract a segment of the Jewish vote. But the African-American voter, traditionally also the Hispanic, but this time Trump seems drawing in some of the Hispanic votes and the Indian-American voter. So over time, the minority voter is gradually moving towards the Democratic side, because that's where they feel that there is a framework for diversity and inclusion where they can get their aspirations met. Because if you look at the US Congress, for example, today we have 5 congressmen and senators of Indian origin.
Right.
And they're all Democrats.
Right.
None of them are Republican.
Yeah.
So that's a dimension that one has to keep in mind. And we have to see how it plays out in the modern context.
Right. Ambassador Sarna, may I also ask you to respond to the deal between UAE and Israel that Trump brokered? As a former ambassador to Israel, in fact, both of you were former ambassadors, how important will this be in the election?
Well, foreign policy issues, I would say, play a marginal role in the election. It probably ups Trump's perception a couple of points, but I don't think this is going to be an issue which is going to be debated as we get closer to the elections as a sort of make or break issue. I think because even I mean, the only thing that it will impact in debate terms, I would be that this deal has stopped Prime Minister Netanyahu's plans to annex
Right.
parts of the West Bank, because that was a divisive issue within American Jewry. There were certain parts, certain sections of American Jewry which would say do it, and there were certain who are as strong supporters of Israel as the other one, believed that this would be a wrong step and would forestall the two-state solution. To that extent, this might play in. And it will be to President Trump's credit, because I believe there will be a ceremony soon at which the leaders of the two countries would come to the White House and be sort of, there'll be a great photo op, which I'm sure will be milked for whatever it's worth. So while foreign policy issues don't really impact, this one to some extent, given the presence of the Jewish voters, would. But then I think the Jewish voters are, for a large variety of other reasons too, very strongly democratic.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that the president's son-in-law himself is Jewish, etc., I'm not sure whether they would be able to move the majority of the Jewish votes towards Trump.
Right.
So that's...
So, yeah, let's talk a little, Ambassador Singh and Ambassador Sana, about the Biden-Harris ticket. Although we would like to assume that it's an American-Indian ticket, it is actually an American, it is a black and white male-female ticket, because those are the two boxes that I think Biden needed to tick quickly. And in fact, I just want to read out what Ambassador Sana wrote recently about our love for appropriating the diasporic Indian. If we don't throw a national party, we will not suffer a national heartbreak. So I think that was quite appropriate. But Ambassador Singh, what do you think about how this ticket will play out for India specifically?
So, if we look at in terms of the Indian American community, clearly, as you mentioned, that Joe Biden selected Kamala Harris as the running mate, primarily keeping in mind the woman voter and the African American voter.
Right.
That makes up the bulk of her population. As Kamala Harris has herself said and written, that she grew up with a black identity,
right,
in a black neighborhood. She studied in a historically black college,
right,
and her initial politics when they became deputy district attorney, then the attorney general in California, was largely along African American politics. So one has to accept and understand that, because that's very much a part of her identity.
right.
But if you see the kind of statements that she has made since becoming senator, and also the kind of statements that she's made once her ticket, her being on the ticket was announced, and the message that the ticket put out on 15th August, it is clear that she's also emphasizing the Indian American identity. And her mother, who is of Indian origin, has played a very important part in her formation, in her growing up. So that aspect has to be kept in mind. And I think it's maybe useful for us not necessarily to look at issues in terms of binary rates, because if you now see reports coming out of the US, aside from the African American community, segments of the Indian American community, the West Indian community,
Yes.
which has a big voter base in Florida, has
Yes.
become very excited about a candidature because
Because
the father is of
Jamaican,
Jamaican
yes.
origin. So I think all these things will have an important role. And for the Indian American community in the US, which for a long time worked, at least the first generation, to go there, do their work, establish themselves economically, but not play a major role in politics, has really evolved over time. The first time we saw a large number of people in the administration was during the Obama administration.
Yes.
And they had a person at the rank of a deputy cabinet secretary who headed USAID. And that process has been taken further during the Trump administration, where you again see a large number of people. And then you had Nikki Haley, who was there at a cabinet level position.
Right.
Now, in a Biden ticket, you have a person who is also of Indian origin and they've said clearly, because Biden in his own messages has referred to her Indian heritage, South Asian heritage, who is now an aspirant for a vice president's position, potentially for a presidential position. So for the Indian American community in the United States, whatever their views may be related to the politics of Kamala Harris, would be completely enthused by what is happening, because that shows that they have arrived in the United States. And again, if you look at Congress till 2016, altogether, historically, there were only 3 Indian Americans ever in Congress.
Right.
Since 2016, at any point of time, there are 5 Indian Americans in Congress. And hopefully this election, there would be more. So you can see that evolution happening. And I think Kamala Harris very much captures the change and the progress that is taking place. And one must recognize that and celebrate that and build on it, because there is the interest, of course, of India, but there is also the interest of the Indian diaspora in the United States that one must factor.
Right. Ambassador Sanna, that is significant because she is clearly now going to be the Democratic front runner for presidential elections in 2024. Quite clearly, she will be Biden's successor, even if the Biden-Harris ticket were to not win. That would be a tremendous achievement. So how do you see her being on the ticket for the Indian American community and for India?
Well, I agree with most of what Arun has said. Perhaps there's a difference of nuance, because I believe that I think it's very clear why she's on the ticket. She's on the ticket because she's perceived as black.
Right.
She's on the ticket because she projects herself as black. And I'm not talking of the last few days, which of course we will see, color can change. So color will change from now to November 3, depending which state who is speaking in. But the fact is that all her work till so far has not been the one associated with the Indian American community, but very mainstream racial politics of black and white America. She grew up as a proud black woman, as she said herself, went to the black choir, she went to Howard University, and all that, which is fine. I think it is politically correct from her point of view, because that's where, the politics plays into, because historically, culturally, politically, America is about black and white. So when the race fight is really on, the race debate is really on, the main counterpoint of white is black. And that is why the importance of the black voters to the Democratic Party is huge. Even within that, the importance of African American women, who are actually the bedrock of the Democratic support, is huge. And 100 people, 100 black leaders, activists, athletes, wrote to Biden last week, I believe, just a couple of days before the final selection, that you have to have an African American woman as your running mate. So he had shortlisted, I think, 10 or 11 people. His teams went through them. He personally interviewed 5 black women, who projected themselves as black. They didn't project themselves as Indian American or West Indian. So I would say that is the heart of the matter. On top of that, there are other pickings. You can pick on the Indian American vote. You can pick on the West Indian vote. Because then you can say she's a woman of color. A woman of color is broader than saying an African American or a black. So yes, you can take advantage. And all this is par for the course. This is real politics. And anybody in her position or in Biden's position who's in for a presidential ticket would definitely play that. As far as the Indian Americans are concerned, I think, of course, they will be celebrating. There will be, in some ways, this is a sort of validation of the Indian American community's success, and so on. They will, however, I mean, my point in all this has simply been one. She will, if she wins, or the Biden ticket wins, and she is vice president, because of who she is, she will have a very influential voice on the India file.
Right.
And when she has that, you have to see what are the positions she's going to take on India.
Right.
And she is a solid, almost middle of the road, bit to the left, mainstream Democrat with Democrat positions.
Will that not irritate India, Ambassador Sarna?
No, this is the point I'm saying, that she will not move from those positions. Right. So she will take India at its merits, our policies at their merits, according to her point of view.
Right.
And we should take her at her merits. Right. Not because her mother was Indian, not because she likes idlis.
But doesn't know how to make them.
She went walking with her grandfather on the Madras beach. All that is nice. It's a nice story. But when people sit at the vice president level, they will take positions on the basis of what they believe and what their party believes and what their party position is. You might get a little segue. It will give us a little advantage. Some rich Indians will fund her definitely. They might be able to open some doors for us. We might have a conversation, icebreaker about India if somebody goes to meet her. But then let us be prepared for her real positions. And we must take these on their merits. We must take these in our stride. We must take these into our calculation, because she is American. She is American.
Yeah, Ambassador Singh, what about Mr. Trump, President Trump's statement, as he likes to always say, I have more of this and I have more of that. He says he has more Indian Americans than Kamala Harris, and better Indian Americans, whatever that means. Do you see a possibility of Pence being replaced by Nikki Haley, or he's too comfortable with him?
No, I don't see any possibility of that. But I think basically, one, of course, President Trump, as you know, has been very provocative in various messages that he puts out. But I interpret this message more that as a signal that the Indian American vote matters.
Yes.
And he's trying to make sure that portion of the Indian American vote that he had attracted towards himself and towards the Republican Party is not siphoned off because of Kamala Harris being on the ticket. In fact, as Natesh mentioned, President Trump had gone to the Houston rally. And for the President of the United States, this was the first time that he went to a rally held in honor of a visiting foreign leader in the United States. And then he spoke there, and not only did he speak, he stayed on for the hour so that the Indian Prime Minister spoke. It was very unusual. And that itself was a signal that the Indian American vote was important to him, because in certain states, he was hoping that perhaps that will bring about some change, or the Indian American funding for his campaign was important, because even in 2016, when there was a lot of resistance to his candidature, in fact, when I was at the Republican convention, many Republicans were, complaining quietly that they were unfortunately nominating the one candidate who could lose to a Hillary Clinton. But they were happy that the Democrats were going to nominate the one candidate that could lose to a Donald Trump. And so given that, at that time, he was not getting much support. But even then, one section of the Indian American community came forward to support Donald Trump and raise funds for him. And according to some reports, they had raised a significant amount of money for him. So much so that, if I remember right, on 16th October 2016, he went and addressed an Indian American rally in New Jersey.
Yes.
So the Indian American vote, Indian American funding is important. And I think that's the reason why he came to India in February, in the last year of his term, and went to this event in Ahmedabad. So this is more just a signal to say that, okay, you have Kamala Harris, who is in a sense also of Indian origin. It has enthused very, very significantly segments of the Indian American community. Because if you see the comments that are there, not just in the social media, and if you look at the funding, in the first 48 hours of her nomination, the ticket raised $48 million.
Right.
It was twice as much as Joe Biden had raised in all of 2019.
Right.
So her candidature has introduced the Democratic supporters, the Democratic fundraisers, the Indian Americans also. And so and therefore, I think Trump's effort was try to see if he could puncture some holes in this.
Yeah.
And that was all that it was about.
But he's actually, if I can just come in on that point, he's actually gone a step further. You know, the Trump campaign has formed 4 sort of ginger groups. Today you have Indian voices for Trump, Hindu voices for Trump, Sikh voices for Trump, and Muslim voices for Trump. And these are all within the Indian American community.
Right.
So you know, they are going to be addressing, working on different aspects of the community. So he does have his support in the Indian American community.
May I just ask each of you a last question? Have we achieved finally a sort of dehyphenation from Pakistan in the eyes of America? Ambassador Sanna?
Well, I think broadly, yes, we have achieved, because if you look at sort of the 80s and, you know, in fact, if you look at right from the mid 60s onwards, when you know, this came to the fore, right to, I suppose, Bill Clinton's days.
Yes.
It was very difficult to break this hyphenation. Whatever happened at that time, I would say perhaps Arun has dealt with this file in greater detail, but I think I would say that it was Kargil which was the definitive moment when this hyphenation actually broke. And for by and large, most of the time, because of the larger India-US relationship today, it doesn't stay, the hyphenation. However, there are times when this comes back. It is a constantly moving target in Washington, D.C. And this is just come back, particularly on the Hill.
Right.
Because there is very extensive lobbying by Pakistan on various issues. It comes back on human rights issues. It comes back on defense issues.
Yeah.
And I think this is something which we will constantly have to carry on and repeatedly make sure that the India-US relation stands on its own legs. For instance, it comes into the debate on Afghanistan.
Right.
On Afghanistan, because if for US for its own purposes needs Pakistan to resolve their own problems in Afghanistan, and hence it becomes not explicitly a hyphenation, but certainly in Indian view, Indian eyes, it becomes a certain lenient treatment to Pakistan for certain things. So this has to again to be taken in a very realistic fashion. This happens. Pakistan has been sort of long-term, I would say a kind of favorite of certain constituencies in Washington, D.C. And that remains, goes up and goes down. But I think for the last 20 years, by and large, we have managed a dehyphenation, and we have to keep it that way.
Right. Ambassador Singh, may I ask you about India-US as a sort of polar opposite of China-Pakistan? Is that a possibility? Can we become as close to the US as we perhaps once were to the USSR?
So, I'll respond to your question, but building on what Navdeep said, historically, I have found that 4 factors have impacted on the India-US relationship. One is, what is the US global priority at any point in time? As a result of the US global priority, what is the role that they see for Pakistan? And that impacts on us. Third, in terms of their global priority and strategies, what is the role that they see for China? And then that impacts on us. And fourth, what is the strength of the bilateral relationship? And therefore, if you look at these 4 factors, you can explain the India-US relationship at any point of time. So the Pakistan-India hyphenation has been there when Pakistan has been relevant to the US, as it was there for some time during the Cold War, when it was part of the US-led military alliance system. Or it was there when the Soviet troops were present in Afghanistan and the US needed Pakistani soil to train militant jihad against the Soviet Union. And it is to some extent relevant now when it wants Pakistan to help them in the deal with the Taliban. But I think the US global priority today is to deal with the challenge from China,
right.
The economic, military, technological challenge. And therefore, they see the India relationship beyond the strength in the bilateral relationship and the opportunities for economic, technological, and military cooperation at the bilateral level. They see the India relationship also very much in the context of the challenge that they're facing from China. As a result of this, and because of this prism that they're looking the relationship through, the India-Pakistan hyphenation will not be emphasized, and that will vanish for a while. And now, given their focus on China, I think clearly there is much more space today for the India-US relationship. And that's the reason why we discussed, as we discussed earlier, the Pacific Command has been renamed the Indo-Pacific Command. The US has the Indo-Pacific strategy, where India is very much a part of whatever they're trying to do in the Pacific Ocean and also now the Indian Ocean. They're looking at enhancing cooperation in the framework of the Quad, which includes, aside from US, India, also Australia and Japan. And so, and then in the context of the recent challenge from China, it is the US that has been the most supportive of India. If you look at what happened in February last year in the context of Pulwama, again, it was the United States that had been the most supportive of India, and the US is also supportive of India in the UN Security Council, along with France and some others. So given that, I think there will inevitably be increasing cooperation between India and the US. But it will not quite be, for some time, the nature of the India-USSR relationship, because at that time, India did not have other options.
Right.
Today, India has other options. And also the challenges would be that, for example, as we build with the US, we have to also maintain our relationship with Russia. Right. Because we want to maintain the strategic autonomy of our decision making. And more than 60% of our defense supplies are still of Russian origin. Right. So at a time when the US has a lot of difficulty in its relationship with Russia, and especially if it is going to be a Biden administration,
oh, yes,
the relationship with Russia will get even more difficult. Right. So despite that, we have to maintain our relationship with Russia. So there will be areas where there will not be a full convergence between the US and India. And the second fact is that the US is clearly the dominant global power still, always meeting some challenges. So when it decides on certain strategies, it decides on its own. And then it expects its partners to fall in line. Even the European countries complain of that. Yeah. Now, certainly India doesn't want to be in a position that once US takes a decision, automatically you line up behind the US. Yeah. You cannot do that, because there'll be opposition in India and it may not meet your interests. Yeah. So I would feel that I think for sustaining the India-US relationship, it is important that we build on different dimensions of the partnership, but maintain the autonomy of our decision-making. And both should understand, both countries, that there will be convergence in many areas. We should work together where there's convergence, but we should both allow space for differences and divergence and not allow that to disrupt the relationship. It was only within that framework that we will be able to advance step by step.
Thank you both, gentlemen. It was really like a master class in diplomacy, in understanding Indo-US relations and understanding how the US, where the US is situated right now internally as well, and the Indian-American voter, and certainly Kamala Harris, the woman of the hour. Thank you very much, ambassadors, and all the best. Thank you. Thank you so much.